All right, guys, Tyler down here at Emerald City Guitars, and today we're back here in the shop to talk about a subject that is increasingly more and more important in the world of vintage guitars, which is refinishes. Specifically, how to detect refinishes on vintage guitars. It can be a huge factor in the cost. Some people say it can devalue a guitar by up to half, although those numbers have changed in recent years. But it is important nonetheless, and there's a lot of confusion out there on how to determine if a guitar is refinished or not. So I've compiled a little list today that I'm going to go through of my favorite few ways to detect a refin on a vintage guitar. Again, this is not a complete list, but the things I'll cover today are going to be able to help you detect the vast majority of refinishes that you'll see. So the first thing I want to cover that's a big red flag is inconsistent wear across the entire guitar, meaning, the body, the fretboard, the neck, the frets even sometimes. So for example, if you have a 50s Fender and the body is super beat, but then you look at the maple fretboard and it looks untouched, then it's almost certainly been refinished. And the same logic can be applied, of course, vice versa, and also to determine the originality of things like fretboards and sometimes even frets. Another thing that kind of goes along with this is that if a guitar was refinned at the factory, back in the 60s or 70s, the factory often used the decal from the time that it was refinished, and not the time of the original guitar. So if you have, again, a 50s Fender, but has a transitional logo, then you know it was probably refinished in the mid-60s. So it's just very important that you make sure that the narrative of the entire guitar is reflected kind of consistently within all its components. So the second thing I look for when determining a refin is signs of excessive sanding during the previous stripping process. So specifically for acoustic guitars, this often means that the top is significantly thin. A tool like this can be really useful in determining the top thickness in multiple areas as well, not just by the sound hole. You'll want to get back as close to the bridge as possible in other areas of the top. And then compare that against data that we have and that you can find online. For example, a pre-war dreadnought from Martin, the top would measure somewhere between 105 and 120 thousandths. Now, if you were to mic this up in several locations and find that the top is uniformly, 95 thousandths, then we could be reasonably sure that it has been refinished and the top thinned pretty significantly. So another important thing to remember about specifically Martin guitars when looking for refinishes is that when Martin refinished a guitar at the factory, they would take the bridge off, but generally they didn't take the neck off, which means that if you take the neck off and you see a little ledge in the finish where it's higher, where the neck meets the body, and lower on the rest of the sides, that's indicative that it was stripped with the neck on and then refinished. This can be really easy to see if you have the neck out for a neck reset. So excessive sanding on electric guitars can be a little bit more difficult to detect, but it certainly is possible. On things like Fender Strats that have a lot of contours, you can take a look at those and compare them against known genuine examples, and that can be a good way. Another thing with Fenders, if you have the pickguard off, really excessive sanding during refins can cause kind of a dive in towards the cavities, specifically the pickup cavities. So if you have a light reflecting, the rest of the top can be very flat and then kind of dip in. That's indicative of really heavy sanding during the stripping process, and that's a refinish. On things like carved tops, like Les Pauls, you can also check that arch for smoothness, make sure it's consistent all the way around, and also consistent to the era in which it was made. The carves from the early 50s on Les Pauls were very different from the later 50s. So if you have that information and you can cross-reference that, it's a great way to tell as well. So the third thing I look for, this is most prevalent on acoustic guitars, but can be very telling, and that is unusual cracking of the celluloid binding and also pickguards. So vintage guitars that have celluloid binding or pickguards made of celluloid are very finicky to refinish. When you're spraying new lacquer solvents onto this material, it causes it to shrink very quickly and crack in a really unnatural way that is super obvious if you know what you're looking for. During the refinishing process, this is a really easy thing to do, so it does happen very often, and sometimes it can even be a good way to detect a very heavy overspray. That's how sensitive this material is. All right, so the fourth thing that I look for is incorrect checking on the finish. Of course, we know most vintage finishes on guitars will check over time, but it can be kind of a tricky thing to replicate accurately. Now, this natural checking is caused by decades and decades of this wood, the original wood, the substrate, shrinking and swelling and shrinking and swelling. And also, the nitro lacquer, this evaporative finish that's continuously shrinking for its entire life. And so that creates a very distinctive pattern that, like I said, can be really hard to replicate. Many times people will try to replicate this checking by thermal shocking. the finish. That means basically, in most cases, getting the guitar very warm and then spraying it with like a compressed air type, very cold spray to cause it to check. And that does cause it to check, but it generally causes a really distinctive sort of broken mirror pattern that is not consistent at all with original instruments. So different brands and even different models within brands tend to check pretty consistently throughout their models and their years because of the design and the consistent application methods from the factory on the finish. So I would always cross-reference if you can, do as much studying as you can on original known examples, pay close attention to the actual pattern and how the guitars check, and compare that against the potential refinish that you're looking at. So one more thing that kind of goes hand in hand with that is to bear in mind the fact that these vintage finishes continue to shrink over time. They shrink down into the wood. So they remain glossy, but kind of conform down to the grain. Now this is a really, really hard thing to emulate. And if you see a vintage guitar with a finish that is very flat, very glassy on top, it's almost certainly either a new finish or put on very, very thick, which in either case would be incorrect. So my fifth and final point for this video, I saved it for last, but it is probably my favorite way to determine a refin. It's pretty much foolproof. It works all the time. And that is looking for a finish where there should not be finish. So for fenders, this is the one that everyone knows about fenders, right? The nail holes under the pick guard, you have the pin router hole under the detuner on the neck. But even more telling than these nail holes, I find, is finding finish in original damage. You got to consider if these guitars were ever considered for a refin in the past, it would have been because they were not in very good shape. They probably had previous damage. And when a guitar is refinished, you either spray over this damage and there's finish inside these dings and such, or it's filled and touched up, in which case that can be pretty detectable as well. If it has been filled in, the guitar will check kind of unnaturally around that area because it's a different material. And if it's touched up, that's a really good application for a blacklight, one of the few, frankly, in detecting old refinishes, where if you were to look at this guitar under blacklight, you could see a notable difference in the fluorescence from the original finish in the touched up area. Another great example of finish where there shouldn't be finish is, Fender headstock logos. They were placed on top of the finish, so if you see finish over the top of those, that is after the fact, at very least an overspray. Same thing on Les Pauls, with the Les Paul silkscreen on the headstock, that was right on top of the finish. So if there's finish over the top of that, again, that's been at least oversprayed. So this is also a really, really excellent tell for old acoustics, specifically old Martins. And like I said, Martin finished separately the neck and the body. So if you see any finish in the joint between the neck and the body around that area, again, that's a big indicator of a refinish. Overspray on top of the bridge or on top of the fretboard or even in the sound hole, again, would be indicative of, at the very least, an overspray, although on Gibsons that's sometimes normal from the factory in certain periods. So again, you really just have to do your homework on what you're looking at, the year and model, and compare that with specifications that are well documented. So again, that list is wildly incomplete. There's so much more I could talk about, but for now, this is a really, really good start and will help you suss out most refins that you'll see out there. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. As always, thanks for watching.